Under the Trump regime, the United States government is collapsing in on itself. Multiple government agencies we rely on for our health and safety are in complete chaos due to catastrophic mismanagement and failures of leadership from Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert Kennedy on down. Kennedy and other appointees are failing the American people in a way that is certain to cost American lives. Currently, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are facing an unprecedented amount of upheaval. Take a look at this from Good Morning America.
The CDC right now is in chaos. The White House says they've fired the new director, Susan Monterez, after a tense confrontation with HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., in which he insisted that she commit to his changes to vaccine policy and tried to pressure her to resign. But this morning, Susan Monterez isn't going without a fight. She's refusing to leave. Her lawyers say the notification she received is, quote, legally deficient and that only the president himself can fire her. Now, Monterez was only sworn in a month ago, but she has clashed with Kennedy, a vaccine skeptic. Her lawyers say Kennedy is, quote, weaponizing public health for political gain and putting millions of Americans' lives at risk. And she's not the only one protesting. Overnight, at least 4 other top CDC officials quitting en masse, including the CDC's chief medical officer and the director of the Immunization Center.
As it turns out, on Thursday, August 28th, Donald did indeed fire Monterez from her position. Which is not surprising at all. The only thing about any of this that surprises me is that Monterez got the job in the first place, given the fact that she actually believes in the efficacy of vaccines. Speaking of vaccines, it was just announced that although the Food and Drug Administration has approved new COVID vaccines, Robert Kennedy is implementing new restrictions on who is allowed to get them. Robert Kennedy, who has no degrees of any kind in any kind of science, virology, immunology, and is not a doctor of any kind either. He used to be an environmental attorney. Quote, the agency is limiting the updated shots to people who are at risk for serious complications because they're 65 or older or have other health problems. Until now, COVID vaccines had been available to anyone 6 months and older, regardless of their health. The decision is expected to make it harder for many people, such as healthy children and healthy younger adults, to get a shot ahead of the expected winter COVID surge. That's already generating confusion and apprehension that harkens back to the early days of the pandemic when people often had to frantically search for a shot, unquote. That is from a report from WOSU, a media company in Columbus, Ohio. And yes, doesn't it just remind you of the good old days, those early days of COVID when we were all terrified to leave our homes for fear of getting a fatal illness nobody understood? And how ecstatic we all were to learn that a vaccine was coming, and then to find it was 6 months away, and that 6 months felt like an eternity. But then we finally had a vaccine that kept us safe and made it almost certain if we did get COVID, we would survive it. Donald, remember, took huge amounts of credit for what he referred to as Operation Warp Speed. And now, simply because he doesn't know what's going on, and he has put somebody like Robert Kennedy, sociopath, in charge of HHS, he doesn't care if we have COVID vaccines or not anymore. Another agency that is also under assault from the very people tasked with running it is the Environmental Protection Agency. Instead of protecting our environment and, by extension, the health of all Americans, the agency now seems to have as its primary goal protecting CEOs and big corporations. Protecting them from what? Well, from having to comply with unwieldy regulations designed to limit pollution and practices that have an adverse impact on the environment. That's what. Back in January, Donald appointed Stephen Cook as Deputy Assistant Administrator for the EPA. Cook was a lawyer for a chemical company who filed a lawsuit trying to block a rule forcing those companies to clean up so-called forever chemicals and their pollution. Effects from those substances have been linked to cancer and low birth rates. Now, Cook is in charge of the agency that is supposed to clean up forever chemicals, but he's still attacking that same rule from within the EPA. According to a New York Times article from earlier this week, quote, his efforts could shift cleanup costs away from polluters and onto taxpayers, unquote. Yes, that is the other thing he is protecting CEOs and corporations from, having to pay for the damage they cause to our environment. This shift could cost regular Americans billions of dollars while letting big companies off the hook who committed the damage in the first place. I think the simplest thing to remember always when it comes to trying to figure out a rationale for the policies being put in place and the changes being made to agencies that up until now perform their functions fairly well is that nobody in the Trump regime, not Donald, not Robert Kennedy, not anybody else at HHS in a position of leadership cares about the American people. All they care is about protecting billionaires' profits and their own. All of this comes a little over a month after the Daily Beast reported that, quote, many EPA staffers were pressured into early resignations over purposely poor working conditions meant to drive out non-loyalists, unquote. Earlier in the week, 180 FEMA employees signed an open letter to Congress warning that the Trump regime is making dangerous choices at the agency that will make Americans less safe. This includes discarding rules that were adopted to improve disaster response after the organization's slow reaction in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Many employees signed the letter anonymously because they feared retribution, and they were absolutely right to do so. On Tuesday evening, the Trump regime placed a dozen plus employees who signed the letter openly on administrative leave. Later in the week, the Washington Post reported that, quote, in their letter, FEMA employees warned that the Trump administration is sending the agency back to a pre-Katrina era, pointing to several concerns, including the lack of a Senate-confirmed and qualified emergency manager at FEMA's helm, the slashing of mitigation, disaster recovery training, and community programs, and restrictive new policies that curb agency officials' autonomy, unquote. All of this is allegedly to save the American taxpayer money. All of this is going to cost us in ways we cannot possibly imagine. In an interview on Louisiana's WWL-TV this week, Representative Jared Moskowitz, Democrat of Florida, had this to say about the turmoil at FEMA.
It didn't respond up to FEMA's abilities in the Texas floods. And I'm deeply worried about if we got a Katrina-like event, or even less than that. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, these are states that need FEMA logistics. FEMA's not ready.
Many of the states most impacted by worsening climate change, states in which there are more hurricanes than there used to be, and the hurricanes are worse than they used to be, are led by Republicans. Why aren't those Republican leaders speaking out? Do they not care that their constituents are being negatively impacted by the cuts to FEMA? Do they not care that the people who vote for them time after time after time and keep them in power could lose their homes, their livelihoods, or their lives? Well, just like their leader, Donald Trump, Republicans no longer seem to care what happens to the American people either. There's further evidence that FEMA has lost its way on Donald's watch. Well, allegedly. This week, the agency ruled it will not extend the deadline for victims of the May 16th hurricane in St. Louis to apply for individual assistance. Many residents are still struggling from the effects of the storm. Let's take a look at this report from St. Louis's First Alert 4.
Here in many parts of North St. Louis, time stands still. While a lot of the debris and bricks have been picked up from front yards and in the street, a lot of the structural damage remains, and some neighbors say they fear there's no end in sight.
And every time I drive up the street, I see the church, and it just makes you cry.
Gail Davis's family home has sat on Labadee Avenue in North City for 5 generations until May's tornado upended everything.
The tarp on the inside of there, you can see part of the sky.
The roof was ripped off and the home uninsured, so she applied for FEMA assistance.
They just denying us, denying this no, we can't help you with that. Well, you call this number 211. Maybe they can put you in this place, and 211 can't help you either. So you're back to square one. Like I said in the beginning, just going around in a circle.
The American government is designed to help the American people. That's why we get taxed. That's why we pay taxes. So, in time of need, agencies like FEMA can come to our assistance. Or at least that's the way it's supposed to be. That's the way, at least some of the time, it used to be. But currently, the American government is not in service to the American people at all. It is simply a regime in service to the people who are using the American taxpayer to enrich themselves at our expense. And it is only going to get worse. Please take a second and like and share this video. Be awesome if you could subscribe to the channel. If you're listening to us in podcast form, please follow us and give the show a 5-star rating because it really does help other people find our content. Thanks.